As you have fulfilled the conditions, my partner and I have read the codicil. I do not wish to encumber your understanding with its legal phraseology, but I will acquaint you with the spirit of its contents. In the event that your disposition of the $1,000 demonstrates that you possess any of the qualifications that deserve reward, much benefit will accrue to you. Mr. Sharp and I are named as the judges, and I assure you that we will do our duty strictly according to justice, with liberality. We are not at all unfavorably disposed toward you, Mr. Gillian, but let us return to the letter of the codicil. If your disposal of the money in question has been prudent, wise, or unselfish, it is in our power to hand you over bonds to the value of $50,000, which have been placed in our hands for that purpose. But if, as our client, the late Mr. Gillian, explicitly provides, you have used this money as you have used money in the past, I quote the late Mr. Gillian, in reprehensible dissipation among disreputable associates, the $50,000 is to be paid to Miriam Hayden, ward of the late Mr. Gillian, without delay. Now, Mr. Gillian, Mr. Sharp and I will examine your account in regard to the $1,000. You submit it in writing. I believe, I hope, you will repose confidence in our decision. Mr. Tolman reached for the envelope. Gillian was a little the quicker at taking it up. He tore the account and its cover leisurely into strips and dropped them into his pocket. "It's all right," he said smilingly. "There isn't a bit of need to bother you with this. I don't suppose you'd understand these itemized bets anyway. I lost the $1,000 on the races. Good day to you, gentlemen." Tolman and Sharp shook their heads mournfully at each other when Gillian left, for they heard him whistling gaily in the hallway as he started for the elevator.
Now, this is a very interesting story, as we have said about O. Henry stories, because of the end of the story. So let's go through it quickly. Notice that the character of Gillian is, he calls himself a black sheep. He is, he's not very responsible. When people give him money, he goes out and he blows it. He's been raised kind of wealthy. By the way, we might think about that story that we did by Chekhov called The Problem. And we'll remember that there was that young man who was kind of like wealthy, but he was not very responsible. Same kind of character here, right? In your senior year, we're going to study from the 1611 King James Version of the Bible. Here's a 3A observation. We're going to study a text called The Prodigal Son. A young kid goes off and drops lots of money and just wastes money. So that's basically Gillian. And so his question is, what do I do with $1,000, right? And he asks different people. He asks a cab driver. He asks this blind man who sells pencils on the side of the road. Finally, he decides, you know what? I'm just going to give it to this woman who he says he loves. Notice when he asks her, "Do you love me?" she just says, "I'm sorry." That is to say, it's clear that she doesn't think of him as a very good or a very responsible young person, right? Finally, he decides, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to give it to her. Fine, I don't need the $1,000. But when he shows up at the lawyer's office, they say, here's the deal. There was a special part of your uncle's will that said that if you gave the money away unselfishly, and you didn't waste it the way clearly you've wasted a whole bunch of his money before, then you're going to get $50,000. So in other words, you're going to be wealthy, very, very wealthy person. Interestingly, at the end of the story, Gillian decides to tear up the note that says he gave the money to Miss Hayward so that she can receive all of the money. And of course, the two lawyers kind of look at the young kid and go, because he says, I blew it all $1,000. I blew it into track. I went to the horse track. I threw out a bet, which is, of course, a lie. We know what he did with the money. He was going to give it away. Yes, he's going to give it away. He's going to show he was unselfish. Which does beg the question, why? Why doesn't, for example, he take the $50,000 and give it intentionally to her? Why does he allow for her to receive the $50,000 without any knowledge of him being involved at all? And why does he allow these two lawyers of his uncle to continue to believe that he's a good-for-nothing, a discipline? Why? The story ends this way with him whistling as he goes to the elevator. Now that's what happens at level 1. Let's jump now to level 2A. What actually is this story about? Well, let's say 3 things. 1, obviously it's about a young man who is trying to find his way, right? He's trying to decide, to what degree am I a person who is going to be understood as responsible in my future? I've been kind of not a very responsible kid, but now I'm going to start to be a responsible kid. And yet, he makes some interesting decisions along the way as he is growing up, as he is maturing. It's clear he doesn't want to be celebrated at all for the moment that he starts to determine that he's going to be responsible. Number 2, this is a story about value. What does $1,000 get you? In this story, what it gets Gillian is a sense of purpose, we might say, a sense of belonging, a sense of identification with growing up, right? Finally, number 3, this is, of course, a story about love. Namely, you can't buy love. And he comes to realize this. The 2 women in the story both treat him differently and yet the same, right? They both see him as kind of childish, silly. He's always got money and he's always spending money, but he's got no value, no depth, no spiritual depth to him until the end of the story. It may be that by the end of the story he's learned something, right? Finally, at 2b, let's think about our understanding of point of view. Yes? In our story, notice point of view here, we have a third-person perspective. Notice, the story isn't told by Gillian. And we also have an omniscient perspective as well, right? So in other words, that is to say, we know the thoughts of these people. Notice as well, though, that we have a certain kind of dramatic irony in play. Because we know something that those lawyers at the end of the story don't know. We know that Gillian actually wants the girl to receive all $50,000 and not himself. Of course, the $1,000 becomes a symbol, so let's write that down in 2b as well. What is the symbol of the $1,000 in this story? Well, it obviously is in many ways, we might say, a rite of passage of a kind. The young man finally decides to make a decision other than some selfish, narcissistic decision, and that's a pivotal moment, right? All right, let's jump to 3a really quickly. We already mentioned, of course, O. Henry's gift of Magi is a text that you're familiar with that also plays the game of what matters, what's of value. We studied that one in our freshman year. What is a story for you that plays a similar kind of game? Where at the beginning of the movie, maybe, for example, you got some kid who's kind of lost and silly and irresponsible, and by the end of the movie, he's or she figured it out. Kind of grown up, made some decisions that you have to admit are probably decisions that would not have been made at the beginning of the text. Finally, at 3b, what would you do if somebody came to you and said, here's $1 million, and you either have to decide to spend it on yourself or spend it on somebody else? And then when you finally come back to the lawyers to say, I've spent my $1 million, the question will be, if you spent it on yourself, that's all you get. If you spent it on somebody else, you get $10 million. But you only find that out after you've spent the money. How would you spend that money, and for what purpose? Final question. You're now a sophomore. When you look back to yourself as a freshman, you may identify in some ways with what happens in our story here with Gillian. You recognize, I had a sophomore student, a boy, who said this out loud. He goes, I recognize in this story myself, and here's why. I realized teachers in my freshman year, they kind of looked at me the way these lawyers look at Gillian at the end. Kind of silly, sophomoric, irresponsible. And I realized in my sophomore year, I didn't like that way of people looking. I didn't like adults looking at me that way. And I decided I was going to change. But when I decided to change, it irked me to think that I had to do that with other people's approval, like those adults. Because quite frankly, I didn't really respect them either. They didn't respect me, but I didn't respect them. And so the decisions that I'm making to grow up and to mature, I want to make on my own count. What are your thoughts on that? Are you more mature now than you were as a freshman? And to what degree are you making more mature decisions? By the way, notice, we go, in terms of moral development, from egocentric, everything is about me, me, me. I will do whatever I want and I don't care about anybody else in this world, to an ethnocentric values. I care about other people, and I try and see the world through the eyes of at least a few other people. That is to say, I should probably be more self-aware. Our word perspicacity, insight, comes to mind. And I should start to think about how my actions affect other people's lives. And to that degree, How are you growing up and maturing into your sophomore year as you are almost halfway through your high school experience? Well, there you go. O. Henry teaching us some vital lessons. I hope maybe a challenge or two. Thank you.